The United States dropped more bombs in Vietnam than in all of World War II combined, yet somehow they still lost the war. It's a staggering fact, right? Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to impartially break down the specific strategic and cultural dominoes that actually led to the U.S. defeat. Now, when we look at historical conflicts of this sheer size, it is incredibly easy to get completely lost in the weeds. The specific battles, the dates, the isolated political speeches. But in this explainer, we're going to rely strictly on the foundational data to understand the real architecture behind this outcome. We're going to look at how a really profound misunderstanding of the local environment, when combined with an opponent's absolutely unyielding will to fight, engineered this highly complex situation that brute military might alone literally just could not solve.
So we are going to trace a very clear cause and effects timeline across 4 specific phases today. First up, a fundamental strategic misunderstanding. Second, the trap of attrition. Third, the impact of the Tet Offensive. And finally, fourth, the eroding home front.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, a fundamental strategic misunderstanding. So the absolute crucial starting point here is that failing to grasp the historical, political, and cultural setting of Vietnamese society made a lasting victory incredibly difficult from day one. The source data points to a really profound blind spot regarding the local environment. Washington largely failed to recognize Vietnam's centuries-long history of resisting foreign domination. I mean, these are people who had previously fought off both the Chinese and the French. By missing that critical historical context, U.S. leadership essentially mistook a fierce, deeply rooted nationalist movement for just another simple domino in the global Cold War. And it makes sense when you think about it. If you don't understand the history that drives a people, the politics that organize them, and the culture that unites them, well, you're effectively operating in the dark. And this core mismatch grew directly out of that initial lack of understanding. It was like 2 completely different wars being fought on the exact same ground. Washington treated the conflict as a conventional military war, right? They relied heavily on search and destroy missions, traditional front lines, and massive artillery strikes. But the opponent was playing an entirely different game. They were deeply reliant on guerrilla warfare and a strategy of long-term attrition. The Viet Cong used the dense jungle terrain completely to their advantage. They employed the extensive Ho Chi Minh Trail supply network, incredibly deadly booby traps, and these unpredictable ambush tactics. Washington was essentially trying to apply a conventional, textbook solution to a highly unconventional reality, completely underestimating both the true nature of the conflict and the enemy's unbending will to fight. Which brings us right to our second phase, the trap of attrition. Because a quick, conventional victory was just literally impossible against a guerrilla force that completely refused to fight on traditional terms, the conflict evolved into a grueling war of attrition. Basically, a war of attrition is a prolonged engagement where success isn't measured by, capturing a capital city or taking over territory. Instead, it's an attempt to just outlast the opponent through continuous, grinding losses. And to track progress in this type of conflict, the U.S. military relied heavily on a pretty chilling metric, the body count. Success was literally being measured in casualties rather than ground gained. But here's the thing, when you are facing an opponent with an absolute, unbending will, trying to wear them down through sheer attrition becomes an incredibly long, exhausting, and costly endeavor.
And despite bringing the massive, staggering weight of the U.S. military to bear, this strategy simply did not translate into a stable political or military outcome. To put this into perspective, by 1968, the United States had over 500,000 troops deployed in Vietnam. 500,000? Yet these still could not fully secure the countryside. It is a really profound lesson in military history. Overwhelming force alone just cannot solve a deeply political conflict if the foundational strategy is flawed. The troops were there, the incredible firepower was there, but a lasting, stable victory remained completely out of reach.
So that sets the stage for part 3, the Tet Offensive impact. Now, if we look impartially at the Tet Offensive, there's a fascinating, massive contrast between the actual military outcomes and the psychological ones. Militarily speaking, this was actually not a decisive victory for the Vietnamese at all, but psychologically, absolute devastation. Out of nowhere, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched these highly coordinated attacks on over 100 cities simultaneously. They even managed to breach the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. This completely shattered the optimistic reports that had been fed to the American public by military leaders for years. I mean, you had trusted news anchors like Walter Cronkite going on air and telling the nation that the war was mired in a bloody stalemate. It perfectly demonstrates how the psychological shockwaves of a single event can vastly outweigh the purely tactical, on-the-ground military results. And that massive psychological shock leads us directly into our final section, the eroding home front. This wasn't just an overnight change, it was a compounding chain reaction. The grim reality of a long, dragged-out war of attrition led to steadily rising casualties, and as that death toll mounted, combined with the profound psychological shock of the Tet Offensive, public opposition just exploded. We aren't just talking about quiet disagreement around the dinner table. This materialized in widespread, highly visible campus protests across the entire nation and the very public burning of draft cards. Meanwhile, this prolonged, unconventional conflict was causing severe internal strain and plummeting morale within the military itself. Ultimately, the combined, crushing weight of declining domestic support and intense internal military friction forced the political decision to begin a total withdrawal. The architecture of defeat was complete. It started from a fundamental misunderstanding abroad, and it ended with a total erosion of support at home.
So, I'll leave you with this final thought to really consider, and not just regarding this specific historical event, but for literally any global conflict. How does failing to understand a society's history and culture practically guarantee a war with no clear end? Based on the foundational data we've explored today, if you don't truly understand the opponent's political environment and their absolute unyielding will to fight, can any amount of conventional military might ever truly secure a lasting peace? It's a critical question about the absolute limits of force, and it's definitely something I highly encourage you to keep thinking about.